I think that terracing is key. I think it's like a super beneficial strategy, especially because not every farmer has access to irrigation systems. So it's a
Mm.
good way to conserve water. A lot of them will buy cisterns or like rain harvesters to be able to then use that water to irrigate their crops. But sometimes, if you're working in an agroforestry system, it's not going to be able to fill up all the way if you have shade trees in the areas, and you kind of have to play into your environment a little bit more.
This episode of Voices from the Field explores the ancient Taino Conuco farming systems of Puerto Rico in a conversation between NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Gabriella Soto-Velez and researcher Joseph Navarro. They discuss how these sustainable practices supported self-sufficiency during pre-colonialism times, their evolution through colonial and industrial transitions, and their potential to transform Puerto Rico's future and address modern challenges like soil erosion, food insecurity, and climate resilience. Let's listen.
Hey there, everybody. This is Gabriella Soto-Velez, and I'm a sustainable agricultural specialist with NCAT. And today I'm really excited. I'm going to be speaking with Joseph Navarro. He's a PhD candidate in environmental science in the University of Puerto Rico, and he's working right now as a sustainable coffee production specialist. And so today we're going to be talking about Puerto Rico. We're going to be speaking about the past, the present, and then hopefully the future and what we want from the sustainable agriculture, ranging from Taino history all the way to modern day agriculture. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Joseph?
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me. It's a great opportunity to be able to, talk about this topic, something that's I'm super passionate about. So my name is Joseph Navarro. I'm born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and I spent a lot of time living in Florida and Puerto Rico. My family's from Aguadilla and Ponce, and I currently live in Ponce. Right now, I'm working with Pro Café in a project called Café del Futuro, which is coffee of the future in English. And what we're trying to work on right now is implementing sustainable practices to comply with NRCS and USDA codes so that these coffee farmers can receive incentives in return for, implementing sustainable changes on their farms, reducing pesticide and chemical usage, implementing shade, trees and other fruit crops and ground covers to help with erosion. And I have a wide range of experience working in greenhouse and hydroponic growing settings, regenerative silvopasture projects, and intensive market vegetable farming, as well as research in soil testing, carbon footprint measurements, and so forth. So,
Nice. I'm really excited to hear about how these programs are working in Puerto Rico. But before we delve into the present, I would love if you would speak about the past in regards to agriculture in Puerto Rico, because I know that there's a really rich history of the Taino people on the islands and within Hispaniola and the Caribbean in general. And they had some really special agricultural practices, which had allowed them to be sustainable within that region. So would you mind maybe touching on what they did, what are Conucos, and how did they work, and how are they sustainable?
definitely. So, the original ancestors of the Tainos, when they made that immigration out of the Orinoco Valley in northern South America, they got to the Caribbean and they mostly settled on the coast and were fishermen. And then, as other groups started emigrating out of South America to inhabit other parts of the Caribbean, specifically other ethnic groups that came from Arawak, like the Caribs, which is a kind of a controversial term in terms of cultural identities within the Caribbean and other groups in the Lesser Antilles. And then they started to make their way more towards the interior. And that is where we started to see a lot more of this agricultural development blossom into, don't want to say what it is today because we still have a lot to learn and implement in that regard. But from what was documented from the first Spanish encounters, it was seen that they had a pretty elaborate agroforestry system that incorporated conucos, are raised beds of organic matter, wood and leaf matter, residuals, and sort of like mulched materials, stacked up very high for ease of harvest, and weeding and management. And some of the crops that they grew, mostly tubers, were yuca, cassava, yapia, elephant ear, malanga, taro, Kunti, which is a very popular native to Florida, consumed by the Seminoles, for their harvested for their roots, the root tubers, and corn, pineapples, papayas, a lot of stuff that I would consider what I call native or endemic to Puerto Rico is actually for ease of defining New World species. So a lot of these lineages for these crops can be traced back to Central and South America, whereas as colonialism kind of developed and international trade became more and more popular around the world, we started to introduce species from Asia like citrus and mangoes and stuff of that variety, tamarind, those types of plants. And in terms of the foundation and the structures of these conucos, a lot of them in the southern part of the island where you're just hitting the rain shadow, they found specifically in Calle settlements of combining retaining walls with this conuco structures to help retain water, because those areas have really, really, really biodiverse microclimates between like tropical rainforest environments to dwarf forests, dwarf montane forests, different types of rainfall, different soil structures, geological makeup, etc. And so a lot of these areas put emphasis on terrace growing, which is a popular technique that we see all around the world. And so it was very popular in the Taino system to kind of incorporate these terrace systems and dig these trenches to retain water and irrigate the crops that way. And so they integrated these different types of fruit trees in almost an alley cropping system where you would have those conucos, and then where we would probably nowadays kind of refer to them as pathways, instead of having just bare pathways, there were fruit trees spaced out in between. So you're kind of mimicking this agroforestry system. And now this didn't really get developed until later on in their societal development. And so they, like much of the indigenous cultures that we've seen documented, engaged in the slash and burn technique of agriculture, like Swidden agriculture, and then using the burnt remains to fertilize the next succession of crops. And so it kind of dawned to them towards the end, not towards the end, but when the Spanish came and they started documenting these practices, they kind of like had come to the conclusion that's like, hey, like this method we're noticing a decrease in yields, and let's see if we can do this of us in a more of a sustainable way. And so that's when they kind of started to move away from the slash and burn, and then just keep building and building and replacing those the burnt char with organic matter from the residuals from all the trees that were in these systems. And then obviously Spanish came, they had different ideas about the development and design of how they wanted their agricultural systems. And, the rest is kind of, more available in terms of history.
From my understanding, I feel like slash and burn isn't always a bad method. I think it's dependent on the fallow period. So, in these regions where they were historically doing slash and burn, they were having 20-year fallows, which would allow all of that carbon to really sink into the soil and then allow more vegetation to grow. So it actually was really sustainable. But as the populations grow, then the fallow periods within those slash and burn systems become smaller. And then that's what inherently causes the destruction of the soil. So then when they went over to doing these agroforestry systems, the conucos, they were probably more chopping and dropping the extra vegetation and residues onto the soil and building that organic matter.
You're completely correct. And there's a book by Irving Rouse called Taino, and in that he talks about that extensively. And so the fallow periods, based off of the paleobotanical studies, they found that the average fallow period was 30 years. And then it reached a certain point where it was like, okay, these systems were so successful, we don't need to keep disturbing them with the burning. And I think that's the case that you bring up in terms of the growing population. I mean, there's a period in time where they had documented, and it's controversial, I have to put that out there, because none of us were here in this time period, but they were saying that there's upwards of 11 million inhabitants on the island of Hispaniola. And, you know, like, you have to, regardless of the time period you're in, you make things happen. You make things work. You find alternatives, and you know, I think that was like the best possible outcome for them. And then, unfortunately, we didn't really get to see the full, no pun intended, fruits of the labor that was put into these systems. I think a great thing is that we do have evidence of other indigenous communities that have tried their best in similar way to preserve these practices. And so that's what we have as the basis to learn off of.
It's really interesting. I've been doing some presentations recently about indigenous agriculture, and I'm learning more and more. And it's almost similar to like the pyramids, how in the same time frame all over the world, all of these different structures were popping up. And it's similar to agriculture all over the world. There's these systems that are replicated within these different cultures all over the world that are really similar, almost identical. And so it's just really interesting how that it almost seems like it's this inherent knowledge that we had to use these systems based on, you know, our ecology and the climate and everything like that. But your point brings me to where I want to go now, and that's kind of after the Spanish came, and then what happened to the Tainos. They were most likely killed off by disease, I'm assuming. And then the US came into play, and that really changed the industry within Puerto Rico. And I'd love if you could elaborate a little bit more on what happened to agriculture and these sustainable indigenous ways.
Definitely. It's a good question. I think a lot of it is still, you know, in terms of the beginnings, like pretty uncertain, because you know, we have to kind of like consult geologists, paleobotanists to understand the evolution of these systems. This is something that I think of very often when I'm driving around, and I'm just like, what did Puerto Rico look like even before the Taino? Because humans were keystone species in Spanish, para bien o para mal, for good or for bad, because we have that opportunity to manipulate our environments around us. And so I think based off of the treatment of the communities and how that has evolved over time, and I say communities, people and its environment as one, the change has been drastic. And so a lot of it, you know, the Spanish, I think, put a lot more emphasis on like export value and kind of like introducing it to an entire continent. And then also, you know, realizing that they, you know, after a certain amount of time, like proximity is key. And that's how the United States, you know, saw in that point of time that they needed to take advantage of it because of its proximity. They knew Spain wasn't going to be able to defend any of those islands. And now something that I think is important to kind of like loop back into the evolution of these communities, a lot of the indigenous communities, because of their continental placement geographically and accessibility wise, has definitely played a role in how these practices and cultural techniques, not just for agriculture, but in general, have been preserved. Because island ecosystems, and there's a book called Jungle out there. The name of the author escaped my mind, but it's a very good book to understand the evolution of like humans and how we go from forest settings, forest dwellings, to grasslands and prairies, and how we manipulate our environments. And one of the chapters is on island ecosystems and the fragility of island ecosystems, and how you disrupt one thing that can alter the entire food chain, entire ecosystem. And humans are no exception to that. And so when you do that, you are throwing the entire balance out of whack. And so a lot of these communities, I think, also prevalent in Jamaica as well with the Maroons. And what I've seen in Colombia and Venezuela and other parts of South America is the indigenous communities and the Afro-Latino communities in those countries formed what we called palenques, which were communities that were typically hidden, secret, that they tried to preserve for themselves. And so I believe that because of their geographic locations, they were able to kind of like be able to preserve that a little bit better. Whereas places like in the Caribbean, like you're on an island, you can only go so far before someone can get you. And those mountains only go so tall. You know, it's a little bit. You know, I'm not an expert in that at all either. So this is it's definitely something that's worth exploring from like a sociological perspective, anthropological perspective, and paleobotanical, geological, all those different branches that you can kind of really like. You know, we need to put more effort into that to really understand the full concepts of how these societies work. So.
So that reminds me a lot of in the contrast between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, when you were speaking about how altering one thing can cause either the success or the collapse of the communities or the societies. And when the French came into Haiti and they took all the mahogany trees and essentially caused extreme desertification on the island. But then you look at the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the Dominican Republic is very green and has a lot of preserved land, and they don't suffer necessarily with the same agrological issues as Haiti, where they really struggle to grow almost anything in their really poor rocky soils. So that is really an impactful thought to think about. And I'll definitely link The Jungle, the book, in the show notes so that people can check that out if they're interested. But I know that when America acquired Puerto Rico as a territory, there was a big transition to get the campesinos, the people from the agricultural lands, into the cities. And being an agricultural worker was almost seen as shameful. And so there was a big push to kind of get them into these factories, and it became a huge fabrication hub in the cities of Puerto Rico. So how did that impact the agriculture and society?
So historically speaking, it's severely impacted it, and we see the repercussions of that today. Utuado, for example, historically known as an agricultural hub, and they're starting to make the comeback as agribusiness, as an agribusiness center, if you will. One of the most biodiverse parts of the island, great people, great identity. And at one point, in terms of landmass, it is like second or third biggest, if not maybe the biggest in the island. And they also had one of the biggest exoduses, if that's the correct word. Exoduses of all the Puerto Rican towns. And so we saw an influx of people coming up to San Juan, influx of people going into Ponce. And then the population went down. And then as a product of that, you know, population went down, there's less consumerism, there's less demand for products, there's less access for products geographically. It's a very geographically difficult place to get to. But that development, kind of like looping back from a societal perspective and cultural perspective, at one point in time, it was an insult to call yourself a jibarito or a jibaro, campesino. It was an insult. Only later on, after, you know, the gag law, la ley de la mordaza, when the Puerto Rican flag was outlawed for a period of time, did people start to like regain the concept of a jibarito as a sense of pride and identity of Puerto Rican people, up to the point where it becomes the representation of the Partido Popular Democrático, the popular political party of Puerto Rico that's in favor of maintaining the status quo as a Commonwealth and territory. And they call la pava, which is the hat that's made of palm trees, the sable palm tree, sable calcareum, that you know, just became a staple. And at one point in time, it was like I wouldn't be caught dead admitting to anybody that I was a jibarito. And it has a different meaning for every people, but it's an important, you know, part of what that is, and as for the diaspora as well, for people to identify with. So yeah, I think the transition was a product of the industrialization times and the demand for work and for cheap labor. It just became a way because people, these systems that were put in place kind of made it they didn't make it economically viable for them to continue farming that way. And they got to this point with the Green Revolution where they're like, hey, we need tobacco, denim, sugar, and whatever else will make us money. And yeah, and then when they did that and they bled the nutrients dry, then they're like, all right, now that you guys are struggling, like you guys can all work in our factories. Pretty much. I mean, like, and that kind of like alters everything. And we saw such a big drop in the census within the 40s and 50s of the farming population in terms of employment was at around like 60%, I want to say, and now it's like 0.2, 0.3%, if that. And so just the drop is insane. I mean, there's a lot of people that are, like, hey, like my dad or grandpa used to farm, like I'm going to do this so I can invest money to buy land so that I can farm, kind of bring it back for full circle. But, it's land ain't cheap. Like there's a lot against you, and a lot of times when you don't, unless you're doing soil samples or working with archaeologists or geologists, you're not going to really get a true idea of what you're going to need to regenerate the health on those farms. Soil sampling, like test kits and whatnot, they help, but you have to work hard. Maintaining a healthy soil, a healthy farm is hard. It's not easy. And not a lot of people have the opportunity to just, or capital to go and do that. So,
would you like a chance at 10 great raffle prizes? NCAT's annual ATRA program survey is underway, and we want to hear from you. How do you use ATRA resources? How satisfied are you with them? What benefits and impacts have you seen from them? The survey helps us identify ATRA resources' strengths as well as opportunities for improving them. It also helps us understand and communicate the impacts of ATRA. Take the survey and you'll have the satisfaction of contributing to an even better ATRA in the future. And of course, you also have a shot at those 10 great raffle prizes. Answers to the survey, which only takes about 10 minutes, are anonymous. So head out to the ATRA website at atra.ncat.org and let your voice be heard. Thank you for helping us make ATRA the best that it can be.
There's a lot of things that are stacking up against agriculturalists in Puerto Rico. Not only the lack of resources, but then also funding. Land is really expensive. And then these natural disasters that keep happening, it's really hard to get a footing, I feel. So that kind of leads us into now and like what you're working on. I know that you received a SARE grant to work in studying Conucos and indigenous Taino agriculture. And I know a little bit about your project. I would love if you could expand upon that. And then I think it would be really interesting to speak about how modern day agriculture in Puerto Rico is now and what we can do to improve it. I know that there's several mechanisms and bodies out in Puerto Rico. They're doing different work for better or for worse, as you were saying. And so maybe we can kind of delve into the nitty gritty and then go from there.
Definitely. So I guess best place to start is the project, because we already kind of talked about like the foundations of how like the Conucos work and how they're set up. So basically I selected 4 different sites, 4 different towns, 4 different biomes, and it was a very interesting process. So the 4 towns were Santa Isabel, which is in the south, falls right in the what we call the rain shadow, which the southern part of Puerto Rico, on the southern half of La Cordillera Central, and the mountain range receives significantly less amount of rainfall, and the majority comes from the coastal systems that move up from the Caribbean Sea. And so in that area, because there's a lot of erosion in the mountain range, all the tributaries and all the rivers then bring those minerals and nutrients down from the mountains into the valleys, and then that then in return creates like super 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 fertile cropland. And so because of the environmental conditions in the south, not a lot of people want to buy land there. So there's a lot of land. I think it's also susceptible to, it's the one that gets hit hardest with hurricanes and earthquakes. But a lot of people purchase that land to then grow monocrops of mangoes or papayas or bananas and plantains so that they can like make use of it. And so my original site was on a 250 acre monoculture or monocrop plantain farm. And I had picked, the site that I had picked was located on like the one hill in the area. And then because of the conditions and like the lack of rainfall, loose aggregate, a lot of like nutrient depletion going on, and lack of microbial activity from the chemical fertilizers, the hill ended up in one really strong storm eroding out. And so I lost some trees because of that, and I had to eliminate it as a site. My other sites was in Calle, en Utuado, and Aguadilla. My site in Calle, I had it was located in the biome or climate, I would say, is a dwarf forest, dwarf montane forest, which I'm not an expert in at all. But if you consult with forest ecologists, they'll be able to tell you exactly how these systems work, and they're very unique. And the fact that we have them in Puerto Rico is something that we need to take advantage of as well and to study. On that site, the owners of the property, when they built the house, had to remove the first level of topsoil. And so it suffers heavy sediment loss, runoff, and erosion. And so it was a really, really, really big struggle for me to get things to thrive in that environment. However, because when I planted my trees, I planted them deep, they were able to retain a lot of water in what we call, like when we, do reforestation projects, the donut, where you kind of create a circle and then you put the tree in, and then the water can then go down and penetrate deeply. And so the roots, all of them anchored super well. And so I had really good success rates with and soil fertility for the fruit trees. But in terms of that first, 6 inches to 12 inches in like the humic levels, like it was tough. It was tough. And I had to backfill with potting mix because of erosion. And so none of my crops did well. And so then Utuado did excellent. Aguadilla did excellent. And I got really good results because of the biodiversity in those areas. Aguadilla is a little bit different because you're battling salt in the air and deforestation, which affects like the precipitation cycles and how quickly you're able to recycle through organic matter. And actually, I don't think I mentioned the two main crops that I was analyzing. So to kind of circle back, I was measuring the positive impact of the symbiotic relationship between sweet potatoes as a ground cover and a nitrogen fixer with ají dulce peppers, which is, a native pepper, and it is economically viable. We saw a $2.50, I think, increase for the market price, and to see how that does in these Conuco systems, in agroforestry systems with 20 fruit trees in a 100 by 100 plot.
That's really interesting. I think that if people aren't familiar with Puerto Rico, there is a huge range of biomes. And so you have a mountainous region in the central portion, and then in the south, it's almost like a desert. And then on the left side, it's pretty dry, like on the west coast, it's more dry. And then there's different biomes. So like when we're speaking about Conuco agriculture, I think from my research, a lot of it was meant to allow water to escape the system due to like heavy flooding. Of course, the organic matter does retain some water, but it's so it doesn't get waterlogged. So maybe approaching it agriculture within these different regions with different methodologies, whether that's terracing or finding ways to keep water in the ground. What are your thoughts on that now that you've done this project and you could evaluate?
I think that terracing is key. I think it's like a super, super beneficial strategy, especially because not every farmer has access to irrigation systems. So it's a
Mm,
good way to conserve water. A lot of them will buy cisterns or like rain harvesters
mm,
to be able to then use that water to irrigate their crops. But sometimes if you're working in an agroforestry system, it's not going to be able to fill up all the way if you have shade trees in the areas, and you kind of have to like, play into your environment a little bit more.
mm.
And across the board from all four sites, the terracing was, my apologies, was a success in that regard, because there are areas and there are certain times of the year where areas like Utuado, which are typically like, I think when I measured it out, they received a total of like 73 inches of rain in the span of 5 months.
Wow.
And that was from the USGS water table measurements
Mm,
for Lago VB station. And so, like, even there, like, it's very, the terrace. So you're correct for sure. But the terrace, I think, balances it out really,
mm,
really well. I think it helps to create the balance. And sometimes you can have issues with like insects reproducing in them, or like well, it all depends on your environment. It depends on your
yeah.
environment. In the south, that's going to be much more of an issue because of the intense heat and the infrequency of rainfall.
Mm,
So like when water is still in those areas, the mosquitoes tend to take advantage of that,
mm,
because it doesn't rain as much. So like then it becomes like more of a problem and stuff like that. But that's more for like human, I guess, related issues. But in terms of those areas, like yeah, and you mentioned before in the West Coast, once you get kind of past west towards Boquerón, past Cabo Rojo, in those areas, it is kind of drier. But when you make your way up, like towards the West Coast in Mayagüez, it's very rainy. Up towards
mm,
Aguadilla, Añasco, Rincon, Aguada, all those towns. But what we're seeing now, and this was explained to me by one of my committee members, who's a geologist, Dr. Florentine Moras, from Florida International University, explained to me that within this process, kind of similarly to what I mentioned to you prior, is that like places like Aguadilla, which typically had a lot more vegetation because of deforestation that's happening in those
mm,
areas to create Airbnbs, luxury living, because Aguadilla is a hotspot. It's like the Boca Raton or Delray Beach of Puerto Rico.
mm,
Beautiful beaches, a lot of things to do, good vibe. So there's a lot of interest there. What happens as a cause of that? That completely disrupts like their cycles in every
mm,
aspect, in terms of nutrient cycling, in terms of like the pressure systems. And so what he explained to me is that because there's a disruption from deforestation, there's less organic matter, there's less vegetation present, there's not enough moisture that's being attracted to
mm,
the area. It's altering the pressure systems. And so the pressure systems are, when they come from the northeast and then towards the northwest, shifts upwards and pushes
mm,
up through southeast Florida, up from the mid coast and towards Bermuda. And so, because the Bermuda system is so strong and the pressure gets diverted up there, it is making it so when the storms come from that area, they don't penetrate up by the southeast as strong anymore. That's why in the last hurricanes that we saw, they didn't get hit as hard on the southeast, and it's getting shifted more towards the Gulf
mm,
and up towards like the north west coast of Florida. And that is due to the changes in pressure. So these are all kind of like domino effects of each other that like
mm,
affect it. And like it's just kind of like interesting to kind of see that in real time, because when I was little, it always rained without fail in Aguadilla.
mm.
And recently, for comparison, like in the same 5 month span that Utuado rained 73 inches, Aguadilla rained a total of 3 inches.
Wow.
And it's just incredible because everyone's like, I don't want to live in Aguadilla. It rains all the time. It's like, not anymore. And
Yeah.
we're seeing those changes in the North Coast. in
Mm.
particular.
Speaking of weather patterns, we were kind of chatting before we hopped on the podcast about how Hurricane Ernesto really damaged a lot of the monocultures of plantains. And then we were kind of speaking about breadfruit. And so that kind of leads
Mhm.
us into what are some viable solutions, granted, long-term, faraway solutions, probably that, could be implemented. We're speaking about reforestation or about changing, what you're growing on your land. What are some
Mhm.
things you mentioned breadfruit before, and I've had so many people really interested in breadfruit, and I want to go a
Mhm.
little bit deeper into that eventually, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about, in a perfect world, what could be done in Puerto Rico to get back to that place. Because, 90% of the food is imported into Puerto Rico. It's similar with a lot of the US territories and Hawaii. And, if we're talking about pandemics or storms that cut off access to these things, it can be a really scary situation. So being able to have that food sovereignty again, especially with crops and food that are made for the Puerto Rican biome, if you understand what I'm saying, going back to those healthy, low glycemic starches, because, they do have a really high rate of type 2 diabetes and obesity, especially if they end up going to the mainland. So, how would that system look to you?
It's a loaded question, but a freaking excellent question. It's a great question. I think to start, one of the reasons that I love breadfruit, and I want to give a quick shout out to my colleagues at Victus, because they're right now working with integrated silvopasture systems and intercropping breadfruit trees in the south. Breadfruit is great for Puerto Rico because it is a tree that can grow super well in all the different types of biomes, and you really can't go anywhere. I mean, I know that you've been to Puerto Rico a bunch without seeing them. They're everywhere, and they are really, really excellent carbon. They have really good carbon storage tendencies, and they are a naturalized species. They come from Indonesia, Malaysia, South Pacific Asia originally, but they were naturalized here and they've done super well integrating into the ecosystem. And honestly, it's been kind of a relatively like new integration to like Puerto Rican cuisine, particularly as tostones. And they are definitely superior because and better for you because they soak up less oil and they have much more of like a thin crunch taste when you make them right, and they're just delicious, and they have a lot of different uses. You can make them as limber's, you can use them in flan, and then in terms of like how they're integrated and used in these ecosystems, they really are great for organic matter, nutrient cycling, their leaf drop, mulching. Like they do a lot of that on their own, and they maintain a lot of the humidity and moisture in that soil because of leaf drop. They're just an excellent addition to these local biomes, and because of their strong root systems and their ability to grow all over the island, they're becoming a strong candidate to kind of replace the plantain industry because notoriously plantain and bananas have weaker root systems. And so working in Pro Cafe as an agricultural consultant and seeing the different types of farms all over the island, like that is the biggest intercrop that you'll see. And just this past I think it was in August, we had Hurricane Ernesto, Category 1, and we lost like 60% of our banana and plantain harvest because of that. And one thing that I'm noticing is that the reason why it is continuously planted is because of its value in the market for tostones and plátano maduro, like the amarillos, the ripe plantains, and it grows fast. There's always a demand for it. But at the same time, a lot of farmers put all their eggs in that one basket. And so
Mm.
what happens? And the other thing too is it's for a lot of the government incentives, like one of the NRCS practice codes to comply to receive an incentive. is to intercrop. And a lot of the farmers are like, oh, I intercrop there with banana and plantain with the coffee. So it's like partial shade. And yeah, but the thing is that that also can affect your coffee production as well. What happens when those trees all fall down with the storm? All it takes is a small storm for that to happen, and you lose not only the eggs you put in that basket for the plantains and the bananas, but you're also losing some of your coffee money as well. Your coffee yield get affected, and so there's a lot more things, a lot better planting choices that you could choose, like breadfruit, to put into these systems, or implementing actual shade trees on your farms that you can, because coffee is a shade plant, like shade. You can plant. I only know the names in Spanish, but cojoba, caoba, capa prieto, cedro macho, guamá, which is ice cream fruit. That one I know in English.
Oh, the ice cream bean?
Yeah, we have two different kinds. So we have Guamá del País, which is like the short ones that kind of look like flamboyant pods. And then we have Guamá machete, which is bigger than my arm.
Like a machete.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, like a machete. But
cool.
Both of them do provide good shade and are very good options for coffee farmers in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, maybe going back to these more underutilized or native, naturalized, indigenous crops versus these really delicate crops. You were saying earlier, and this is kind of the case in most places, but the older generation, that they're the people that are still farming now, and they kind of carry these older mentalities when it comes to agriculture and maybe using more synthetic chemicals and agricultural inputs. And so getting this new generation to adopt more natural methods, sustainable methods has been challenging. How, from your research, from farmers you're working with, how is it going? What is it looking like? Is it working?
I'd say yes and no. I think that because of technology and global exposure to like our generation of Puerto Ricans has had success in that regard. A lot of people are taking the opportunity that when land becomes available to purchase the land and start to make it more of a sustainable farm. But like I said, like soil samples are key. Soil samples will tell you and guide you in the right direction that you need to go in. In terms of like the older generation, it's unfortunate. And something that I've seen specifically in my work with Pro Cafe is that they like to go for the easy incentive. They like to go for the money. And just because you're intercropping or managing your erosion by planting vetiver grass, sweet potato, or perennial peanut, and putting these ground covers down, doesn't negate the fact that you're still engaging in pesticide usage, herbicide usage, and chemical fertilizers. The biggest of them is chemical fertilizers because they don't view that as something inorganic. But if you look at it, all of it is synthesized like inorganic compounds. And so like, yes, these are things that kind of like, I mean, if you are doing precise like foliar applications, like maybe they won't have an impact, but there's almost always chemical drift, and there's almost no way of stopping it from affecting the microbial activity and the bacteria in the soil. There's no way it's good for them. And that's the stuff that you need to have good production. And so it's just kind of like all these like research projects and publications are available, and we're kind of just ignoring them. And so it frustrates me because I dedicate myself to serving the Puerto Rican farmer, to serving Puerto Rico and my community, to adopt these practices and promoting them, motivating them to do it. But it's kind of like a shot in the foot almost. And that's something that like I hope that our generation can kind of, through education, which is something that has had no investment in here, and like trying to vote to put the right people in place, that we can keep structure and promote the sustainability in the agricultural sector. Because although they might not understand it now, at the end of the day, like and this is why I can jump on a table and scream and shout and tell them what to do, but I'm much more of a practical person with working with my hands. engaging in these types of projects, like the research that I'm doing, to then go forward and say, hey, you can do this, but instead of like being like, hey, you can do this, and then pointing to nothing behind me, I can show with my hands physically. You can see the numbers, you can see the data, the figures, the actual project plots and the sites that this is something that, there's viability to be adopted island-wide and beyond. You know what I mean?
I've also found that if you are working with farmers, if they have 10 acres, maybe just trying to have them convert 2 acres to something more sustainable and just as their own trial. And then hopefully they can see that there is some financial incentive because you're saving money on inputs. And over time, there is a better yield and you are having more control over pests and disease because you have richer biodiversity, all the things that we speak of, but having them start on a smaller scale can be a good lead in for them to adopt within their whole culture or within their whole plot. So
yeah, that's definitely something that like I'm a huge proponent of. And like I've worked extensively with a bunch of groups in Puerto Rico. Particularly I've worked with agronomist Silmari Robles, and she's based out of Mayagüez, and she works and specializes in using biological controls and services. So they have like a hatchery of different like biological predators, like beneficial insects that you can release into your farms. And like, I love that. I mean, obviously it's something that it's like, you're introducing species. There's always going to be, that what if, like, because you're manipulating your environment. That's why it's always recommended that you have to make sure that you have established populations in. So when you work with APHIS or you work with different agencies within the USDA that focus on that, you have to rely on the professionals to be able to identify the types of pest presence in your farms, so that way you can accommodate accordingly. Because you could be like, I'm going to introduce this predator. That predator is not necessarily going to be going for the types of pests. So you have to, make sure that you're doing it appropriately. And they're really good at that. Like they create really, really well-tailored programs to be able to like combat some of the pest pressure that we're seeing. And that combined with, there exists biological controls in the form of plant matter-based pesticides or biopesticides, which you can use as other alternatives. Like there's no shortage of chicken and livestock that you can, use their manure to create compost systems, hot compost, vermicompost, compost tea, foliar applications, because, it's mountainous terrain. It's not like you're flat in Florida and you can just run it all the way around and then you're good. So sometimes people want the ease of access by walking around with, we call the bombas, or the
little backpacks.
The little backpacks to do the foliar sprays, which I'm a huge proponent of. I use that when I'm applying like neem oil or organic fungicides or the compost teas. It's really, really good. And it's a little bit, safer, that's in your control. What happens if the pipes break on your irrigation system, or you didn't dilute it enough and the particles are getting stuck in the drainage systems and passing through. So, there's a lot of different things that you can work with. And I know that there's organizations out there like that really want to promote these types of practices. And, I was lucky enough to be awarded the SARE grant, where they really see a lot of promise in implementing these types of practices on farms. And I hope to be able to, in the future, be able to kind of like, when I accumulate more capital, be able to, have my own farm, and then I can really show, what I'm capable of, and what everyone is capable of, that they can apply to these systems and make it work. So.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That seems like a really good idea, having your own educational farm, bringing people out there and showing them what really is possible with minimal inputs and doing things a sustainable way, growing local, native, indigenous crops. It's a really beautiful idea in future. You have to invite me out there once you get it all set up.
Definitely. I mean, if you want to help too, we can always.
Oh yeah.
You can't have enough hands on the farm to help. So.
I'm there. Well, Joseph, thank you so much for, sharing this information with us. It was really fun being able to connect with you and learn more about Puerto Rico and what you're doing specifically. I would love it if you could plug whatever you want to plug and where people can find you. How could they contact you?
Definitely. So I'm not a big social media person, but I am present and active on LinkedIn. So you can find me on there. My name is Joseph Navarro. If you ever want to connect, or if you want to learn about more sustainable agricultural projects going on currently in Puerto Rico. Very involved in that industry down here, as well as I have some connections in the U.S. Virgin Islands through SARE and all the Puerto Rico universities as well. So quick shout out to the Agroecology Environmental Science Program at Florida International University, my committee members and my two advisors, Dr. Chris Jayachandran and Kara Rockwell, as well as Florentin Rojas and Dr. Sotomayor from Mayagüez, and Dr. Nitsch from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, which I would be then taking my next steps in studying forest ecology and working on expanding my current project to work with ProCafe and the University of Puerto Rico and kind of expand it, make it more on a larger scale, working with the farmers to see if, gauge interest and whatnot. And a huge, huge, huge shout out to Dr. Jaime Pagan, because without any of his research, we would be nowhere. We'd be nowhere, and we wouldn't know anything about what the Tainos did and the types of crops that they grew and the rollout. And so, yeah, big thanks to him for his pioneer work.
Awesome. I'll link all of that in the show notes and some of the books and articles that you recommended as well. But thank you again. This was really awesome.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.